Welcome again to our series, Reaching Jehovah's Witnesses in Love. Today we are focusing on two chapters. It is because there are not many questions I'm asking from each chapter, so I'm putting together chapters 18 and 19. When you see the questions based on these chapters, you might decide to do them together, or maybe you want to do 17, 18, and 19 together. It's really up to you. Or maybe if you have discovered yourself other questions about the organization, maybe you want to do the chapters individually after all and ask other questions about the organization, about their teachings, or other things you may have discovered since I created this video. So if you decide to go with a different format than the one I suggested, please let me know in the comments below how you decided to use the material and what other suggestions for improvement you might have. And again, I'm asking that if you're a Jehovah's Witness watching this video and you think that I misrepresented the teachings of your society, please let me know in the comments below. But again, put links to any materials, relevant materials on jw.org or other publications so that I can check those references. So, since we are studying these chapters together, I merged the first question into one. Could you summarize chapters 18 and 19 for me and explain how they help us have life by means of the name of Jesus? If you follow this series, you know why I'm asking this question. If you have not followed the series, please watch the first two videos in the series, and then the video for John chapter 1, where I explain why I'm asking this question every time. Next question. So this is based on John chapter 18. It's based on 18 verse 31. They wanted to kill Jesus. What exact accusations did they bring against Jesus? Now, obviously, you're probably aware that the religious leaders had many reasons for wanting to kill Jesus. Of course, on the surface, those reasons were theological, but deep down, it could have been jealousy that Jesus was so popular. Maybe they were upset that Jesus was ruining their money-making enterprise at the temple, so they had many reasons. But when you are asking Jehovah's Witnesses this question, you may want to refer back to John chapter 5. In John chapter 5, verse 18, we read, "This is why the Jews began seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was also calling God his own Father, making himself equal to God." Right? So some of the reasons they wanted to kill him was that he claimed to be the Son of God, and in their eyes he was making himself equal to God. So what happens at this point, I don't know how our previous study went, but at this point you may want to look again at Philippians chapter 2, and especially at verse 6, where it says that Jesus, before coming to earth, he already had the very same nature or the very same form as the Father. So this means that Jesus is as much God as the Father. But although he had God's nature, he never attempted to usurp God's authority. If that's the case, why are they still accusing him here? So that's pretty much the question you need to ask here. You need to emphasize on the fact that Jesus already had God's nature. Okay? If Jesus had God's nature, that means that Jesus is as much God as the Father is. So I think you should mention this phrase exactly to them. If Jesus has the same nature as the Father, it means that Jesus is as much God as the Father is. Of course, they cannot agree with this. Remember that they believe that Jesus is God's first creation, Archangel Michael, and that through Jesus, God created everything. Actually, there are many good videos on YouTube. I might create one where I discuss whether Jesus is Archangel Michael or whether he was Archangel Michael before he came on earth and became again Archangel Michael after he left this earth. What I discovered recently is that in the book The Finished Mystery, published in 1917 and 1918, Russell actually identified Michael with the Pope. So Michael of the book of Revelation is identified as the Pope, and Michael's angels are identified as the bishops. So about 100 years ago, the organization used to teach that Michael is the Pope, and now they teach that Michael is Jesus. You know, these two teachings couldn't be, as more far apart than they are. They say that, okay, they've got new light. But remember, if this is new light that Jesus is Michael and Michael is Jesus, how about the old teaching that Michael is the Pope? Was that light as well? Was that true at all? If it wasn't true, they didn't have old light, they had old darkness. So what they were preaching at the time was darkness and not light. And I think that's really important. I suggest you look in the finished mysteries. I'm going to put some links below about what they used to teach at the time in the book, The Finished Mystery. So, again, I don't know how the discussion went with them when you studied John chapter 7, because at that time I suggested that you look at Philippians chapter 2. If at that point you couldn't quite study Philippians chapter 2, or if the study was not very conclusive, you may want to pick up again on that study here. In the description, I'm going to put a link to a video by James White, and I think he does a good job explaining what it means that Jesus humbled himself. You see, you can only humble yourself when you have a high position, and then you take a lowly position. That means to humble yourself. If you already have a lowly position, then what do you mean by humbling? And his example is pretty much, imagine that you have the White House, and in there you have the president and you have the janitor. The president humbles himself by taking a low position, but the janitor cannot say, oh, I humble myself because I didn't try to usurp or kill the president, right? What kind of humility is that on the side of the janitor by not trying to usurp the president? You see, we are told about Jesus that he did not try to usurp God, but he took a lowly position. So that means he must have had the high position to start with. Please watch that video and see the explanation. So that's pretty much all from John chapter 18. Moving to John chapter 19, I have a question from John chapter 19. It's based on verse 18. Verse 18 mentions that Jesus was killed on a torture stake. But in Matthew 27:37, we read that they posted a sign above his head. If he was crucified with the hands up, as on a torture stake, then the sign would have been above his hands, not above his head. Now, of course, they might argue that since the arms were above his head, obviously the sign was above his head too. So remember that they believe that Jesus was not crucified on a cross, but rather he was crucified on a stake with the hands above his head. So if the hands were above his head, then the sign was above his hands, not above his head. But they will say, oh, okay, but yeah, it's still above his head because his hands were above his head. So, but that doesn't make much sense, because you could say that the sign was above his chest or above his belly or even above his thighs, because it was above his whole body. But I think that the gospel writers only mentions the topmost part of his body, namely the head, and the sign was straight above his head. It was not above his hands. Now, they will probably insist that it was Jesus died on a torture stake. So you might want to ask them, well, how can you be sure? How can you be sure that it was a stake and not a cross? You see, for us, actually, this is quite irrelevant whether he died on a T-shaped cross or on a plus-shaped cross or on an X-shaped cross. It doesn't really matter. What really matters is that Jesus died on a piece of wood for us. He died on a tree to pay for our sins. So for us is really irrelevant. But since for them it is so important that Jesus died on a stake, I think it's important for us to press a bit further this point. What they teach that the cross itself is a pagan symbol. So having Jesus dying on the cross, that associating Jesus with a pagan symbol. And instead we should believe that Jesus died on a stake. So if you ask them, how can you be sure that it was a stake and not a cross? They might reference some of their materials that try to prove he died on a stake and not a cross. So if they argue that Jesus died on a stake and not on a cross, you might want to make reference to one of their materials. It's something really important. I mentioned that even in the introduction. Namely, it's very important when you read their articles to uh, to check whether what they quote from the other articles or whatever they quote from other publication, what they quote from the Bible, really supports their point. And I'm going to show you one of their articles here where they try to explain that Jesus actually died on a stake and not on a cross. Why the Watchtower publication show Jesus on a stake with hands over his head instead of the traditional cross? And they explain something like this. The Greek word rendered cross in many modern Bible versions, torture stake in the New World Translation, is stauros. In classical Greek, this word meant merely an upright stake or pale. Later, it also came to be used for an execution stake having a crosspiece. The Imperial Bible Dictionary acknowledges this, saying, the Greek word for cross, stauros, properly signified a stake, an upright pole, or a piece of paling on which anything might be hung or which might be used for impaling, fencing in, a piece of ground. Even amongst the Romans, the crux from which our cross is derived appears to have been originally an upright pole, right? So they say here, Jesus died on a torture stake, not on a cross-shaped implement. How do we know that? They say, well, the Imperial Bible Dictionary acknowledges this. And then they give that quote, and you read the quote, and you get the impression that what? Yeah, Jesus indeed died on an upright pole. Okay, but it's interesting that you have these dots in line, this ellipsis here. What happens when we use this ellipsis is because whatever is there in the original text is insignificant for our conversation, so we leave that out because we only want to focus on the significant parts. But is it really because it's insignificant what's in there in the original? Or is it because they are not quite honest here? Or rather, I would say they are quite dishonest in the way they quote that article. What happens in the description below the video, I put a link to other videos and also a link to this article and to the dictionary that they quote. So they quote that dictionary called the Imperial Bible Dictionary. Let's have a look actually at what the Bible Dictionary says. I'm afraid that the quality of the image is not great, but as I said, there is a link in there. If you find cross and crucify, you will find the bit that they quote in here. They say the Greek word for cross, stauros, properly signified a stake, an upright pole, or a piece of paling on which anything might be hung, or which might be used in impaling a piece of ground. Okay, and after that, if you look at the original article after that piece of ground, that's where you have the ellipsis. But what's in the original? In the original says, but a modification was introduced as the dominion and usage of Rome extended themselves through Greek-speaking countries. So actually, you are told that there is another piece that was introduced. They quoted that one out. Why? Why leave that one out? And they move on. Even amongst the Romans, the crux from which our cross is derived appears to have been originally an upright pole, and this always remained the more prominent part. That's pretty much the end of their quote. Okay? But actually remained an upright pole. They actually continues. This always remained the more prominent part. Why do they say the more prominent part? Let's keep reading this article in the dictionary. But from the time that it began to be used as an instrument of punishment, a transverse piece of wood was commonly added. Not, however, always even then. Okay, so they acknowledge there was another piece, but not always there. However, there is another bit at the very end of the paragraph here that says, there can be no doubt, however, that the latter sort was the more common, and that about the period of the gospel age crucifixion was usually accomplished by suspending the criminal on a cross piece of wood. So they quote this dictionary article to support their idea that actually Jesus did not die on a cross, he died on a stake. Yet when you read the article does not claim that. It says yes, before Jesus that was the case originally, but then actually the proper way of crucifixion was actually on a cross piece of wood. So the cross was the proper implement that we know it. You can read the article a bit further, and it explains what other types of crosses they were used. So the way they quote that article, it's not honest, because the article claims the exact opposite of what Watchtower claims. So that's about all for John chapters 18 and 19. If you find these chapters, if you find the material that I prepare for these chapters useful, please like, subscribe, and share these videos with your friends or other Christians who could use them. And I'll see you in John chapter 20, where we have a huge lot to talk about.